I'd like to call the meeting to order. Roll call.
Kavanaugh,
Here.
Bagley,
Here.
Dowd,
Here.
Friend,
Here.
Frost,
Here.
Patterson, Howard.
Here.
Open Meetings Act. I would like to advise those in attendance that a copy of the Open Meetings Act is posted at the rear of the boardroom, right back there. We'll first have a recognition of one of our employees. Stephanie?
Figure out where to stand.
No, I don't know. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Morning.
This morning, I'm excited to have the opportunity to present to the board one of our meter readers, the Outstanding Service Award. This award recognizes employees that have taken an action that benefits our community and the district by going above and beyond the call of duty. We'll be presenting the award to Ashley Wilds, and at this time, I'll ask that she join us up here. So Ashley came to work on March 25th thinking it was just going to be an ordinary day. She was on her route reading meters, and at around 9:30 in the morning, she saw a 2-year-old little girl in pajamas and bare feet. The overnight temperature was 27 degrees, so it was really chilly outside. Ashley walked over to the child, who was very scared, and she was asking for her mother. So Ashley gave the little girl her coat to keep her warm and picked her up and reassured her that she would help her. She called 911 and she called her foreman. By the time that her foreman got on scene, the police were already there to determine where the little girl lived. The child felt comforted by Ashley and refused to go to the police officers. So she stayed with the child until she could be released to her parent or the adult at the home. So on that day, I feel that Ashley went above and beyond the call of duty. She took the initiative to help a small child that was in need, and this helped to halt a potential disastrous event that could have occurred. So for that, I'm recommending her for this award.
You gotta get a picture.
Oh, sure.
Thank you
very much.
Yeah, problem. Thank you very much.
Great job, Ashley.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job, good job.
Thank you.
I'll say a few words about
Sure,
that.
go ahead.
Okay. Well, I didn't want to get into the way of the most important thing we'll do today. That was very nice. That's always a nice opportunity for the board and our ratepayers. I wanted to tell you a little bit about why the cameras are in the room. For MUD and our staff and for the public, we are now going to be testing filming MUD board meetings every month. This particular setup may or may not be the end result of what we do, but for today, we are capturing the video recording along with the sound recording, and we're going to take a look at what that end result looks like. In the future, if we go forward with this, we are going to be live streaming MUD board meetings each month. We may or may not change the camera configurations depending on the view here. But in the meantime, these two cameras, although they're a little intrusive, be careful when you walk around the room. They do have legs, and if Jack runs around the corner, I'm afraid of what might happen. So. And keep in mind that when you speak, please, you know, like me, I have to force myself to project, so if you can do that, that would be good. And for the public and for staff, for now, if we could present our information at the end of the table and you can stand or sit, whatever, it doesn't matter. The camera view right now has both this side of the table and that side of the table, and this particular camera does pick up the attendees also. So if you do speak from the seats, it will pick it up. So appreciate your cooperation. We're trying to fulfill one of the transparency objectives of the district and the board, so we hope it works out, and any suggestions are very welcome.
Yeah, boy, it'll pick up everything. No nose picking.
Jim and I already talked about it.
Audit Committee.
Okay, we'll move into the agenda, tab 5.
Audit update. Today we have with us Kevin Smith, assurance partner with RSM. Last year we would have called them McGladry. They have changed their name, so it's now RSM. It's been a pleasure to work with Kevin and his team this year. They were extremely helpful as we implemented some new complex accounting literature that you'll hear a little bit more about in a while that applies to financial reporting requirements for governmental employers who provide pension benefits to their employees through a trust. So it's pretty complex, but you'll hear a little bit about it both in his and Pat's presentations. So, Kevin?
Morning.
Morning.
Thanks, Deb.
Morning.
Well, as Deb mentioned, I'm here to present the results from the 2015 financial statement audit. There's a couple things you have in front of you that I'll speak about a little bit. One is the larger bound document. That's the financial statement report. And then the report to the board of directors is the smaller document. This document here contains some required written communication that we are to make to the board at the end of the audit process. And so I'm going to flip through this real briefly and then touch on the financial statements as well. And feel free to interrupt if you do have questions as I go through this. First of all, on page 1, just a few things to note here. The main purpose of our audit is to express an opinion on the financial statements as to whether or not they are in conformity with generally accepted accounting principles. And so that was the main goal of our audit, and I'm pleased to report that the opinion that we have in the financial statements is an unmodified or a clean opinion. So that is the highest level of an opinion you can receive on the financial statements from an external audit. As Deb mentioned, there was a new accounting standard this year that had a pretty large impact on MUD's financial statements, and those are the new GASB pension standards. And so, in the past, the unfunded portion of the district's pension liability has been disclosed in your financial statements, but it's never been reported on the face of the financial statements as a liability, both for the district and all local governments and state governments that have defined benefit pension obligations out there. And so for the first time, this liability is now shown on the face of the financials, and so the equity of the district was restated by about $40 million. To pick up that liability at the beginning of the year. And as of the end of the year, that liability was about 66 million. So you'll see that liability now shown right on the face of the financials, and there's probably about 5 pages of note disclosures in the footnotes to the report that give a lot of details about the actuarial assumptions that are used. It shows a sensitivity analysis to show what some of the changes in assumptions might have on that ending liability. So there's a lot of good information in there now that has not been in there in the past about the pension. That was the only new accounting change this year for the district. A couple things to note on page 2. When we perform the audit, we are required to disclose to you any audit adjustments that we propose as a part of the audit process. There was only one adjustment, and I would say that it was not a significant adjustment to the financial statements. It was just related to cutoff for a timing for accounts payable. So you'll see that transaction disclosed back here on page 5 of the report is for about $300,000. But other than that, there were no other journal entries that had to be made as a part of the audit process. Deb and Joe and their team do a great job of being prepared for us and having the financial information in order so that we don't have several adjustments as a part of the audit. We didn't have any sort of disagreements or significant issues or difficulties performing the audit. We were able to receive information from everyone in a timely manner. No difficulty having access to information or anything like that. If there were any of those issues, you'd see those disclosed here as well. Towards the bottom of page 2, we refer to the report over internal control in accordance with government auditing standards. As I mentioned, the main purpose of the audit is to form an opinion on the financial statements. The purpose of the audit is not an internal control audit, but we do look at internal controls as they relate to the financial statements. And if there were any sort of significant deficiencies or material weaknesses in internal control, those would be reported to you in writing here. And so you will not see either of those reported. The remainder of this report, you've got a a couple pages that talk about significant accounting estimates. So there are certain items within the financial statements that are considered estimates. Those are things that we look at as a part of the audit process. We look at management's process for making those estimates. We test those estimates to make sure that those are reasonable, and we did not have any issues with any of the estimates that we were testing. And then you've also got several pages of this report that is just a copy of the management representation letter that they sign at the end of the audit process. And then the letter at the very back is that government auditing standards internal control letter that I referred to, that you'll see as a clean report. You don't see any deficiencies noted within that report. Any questions on this document?
In short, everything's okay.
Yep, no significant findings as a result of the audit. So I wasn't going to go into a whole lot of detail on the financials. We did meet with the audit committee. We attend all of the audit committee meetings, and we went through the financial statements and these items in detail at our last meeting. So I won't go through the numbers much, but as I mentioned, you'll see the clean opinion here in the financial statements on page 1 and 2. Then this report does have a management's discussion and analysis at the first portion of the report that does a narrative of some of the significant changes in the financial statements between 2014 and 2015. And then after the statements and all of the footnotes, there's also a section in the back, a statistical section that shows in some cases, a 10-year history of some of the schedules are 10 years, some of them are comparative. Shows the operating statistics and other financial statistics about the district. It's a very helpful section to read as well. If there was anything you wanted me to go through in detail in that report, I'd be happy to, but I think you've seen most of the numbers, and as I mentioned, there weren't any significant adjustments to what has been reported to you in the past.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Like Kevin did say, there are 6 pages, I think, and a pension footnote that's somewhat new disclosure and pretty enlightening. Pat will cover some of that in the next part of the presentation, but I would encourage everyone to look at that at some point. Okay, now you get me. I'm just going to do a real brief review of the financial statements. What I do want to remind everyone is that we do put our monthly financial statements are available on the website, as well as the documents that you have today are available on our website. We are also more than willing to meet with any of our board members to go a little bit deeper on the financials if you want to do that at some point. So I just have a few slides now to cover that are up on the screen. Water operations is the first slide. I'm going to do water, gas, and then just a quick combined view. 2015 water revenues were just slightly less than prior year by about $2.9 million, and I'm up in the left-hand top quadrant, or 2.7%, while volumes were down almost 15%. Revenues were lower than 2015 budget by $10.4 million, or 9.2%, while volumes were down almost 20%. Weather plays the most significant role by far in whether our volumes of water sold are up or down to budget and prior year. Budgeted volumes are based on a longer-term average of weather predictions. Both 2014 and 15 were under longer-term average volumes, whereas the 2015 budget would have been based on that longer-term average. Our rate structures, I want to remind you, have both fixed and variable components, and slightly more than 50% of our charges are somewhat fixed on this side. This explains why you'll always see the volume variance be higher than the revenue variance. This also allows the district to manage through these peaks and valleys easier without having to directly impact our ratepayers on a short-term basis. We have a very large asset base in our water division between our 3 water plants and the pipe infrastructure in the ground, and this is a fixed structure regardless of volume. On the operating expense graph, the gold portion is primarily the interest we pay on bond issuances. We kind of call that non-operating. 2015 budget and actual results there are higher due to the fact that we did do the 2015 water bond issuance, and costs of approximately $900,000 are expensed related to the bond issuance in the year that it's done. All other operating expenses at the district were favorable to budget by $2.4 million, or about 2.6%. 2015 operating expenses were $5.4 million, or 6.5% more than the prior year. We had originally projected that increase to be slightly higher, so the district was able to manage and hold operating expenses down during the year. Finally, the last graph on the slide shows that our net income was less than both budget and prior year. Obviously, ideally, this is not a positive result. However, when looking at the slightly lower operating expense, that offsets some of that revenue miss, and then when I talk about capital on the next page, you'll see that we were able to manage capital. The next slide here shows our capital expenditures. You can see that we had originally budgeted $46.1 million for 2015, and we actually spent $37.5 million. So we had about $8.6 million less than we had budgeted. You get into the colors of money here. We talked about that a lot at the budget as to what piece of our rates pay for what, but the management team here at the district continually works to manage and mitigate any shortfall in cash flow current year, so that, you know, we don't have an impact if we're seeing revenue lower. We spend time on a quarterly basis on that, and here in 2016, we've obviously had a fairly warm first quarter, so we are looking at that now to make sure that we can mitigate that with, you know, cash flow and things like that. Next slide is gas. 2015 gas revenues were $93 million net revenues, and they were favorable to budget by about $1.4 million. Net revenues that we're starting with here are revenues less the cost of gas sold, which is passed through to our ratepayers. So the net revenue is really what we have to cover our operating expenses and capital with. Volumes were unfavorable to budget by 4.2%. You typically, if revenues are favorable, you'd see volumes favorable. Our 2015 budget did include higher gas prices projected than actually happened. Our gas prices were lower than budget, so that was favorable to our ratepayers. As compared to prior year, net revenues were 6.4% lower, with volumes unfavorable by 12.6%. Again, on this side, weather is the main driver of our volume differences. Our rate structure on the gas side has fixed and variable components, and on this side, our fixed charges are about 30% of your total gas bill. Gas operating expenses were favorable to budget by 3.9%. The district had almost 60% fewer gas main breaks in 2015 as compared to 14, and 30% fewer gas leaks completed. So we are seeing, I think, our gas infrastructure project make an impact here. Also, statutory payments, when revenues lower, are lower here at what we pay to the municipalities and cities that we work with. The slight gold you see on the operating expense, you can hardly see it there in 2015, is $1.3 million, and primarily related to a non-cash write-off of the mobile radio-related assets related to the early termination of that contract. Overall, gas operations overachieved budget in 2015 on a net income basis by $3 million. In addition, next slide, gas capital spend was favorable by about $12.8 million to budget. Some of these projects would have been analyzed and either moved to 16, or we would have determined to do them for less money or not at all. The total district view on the next slide. I'm not gonna, this is just a culmination of both the other slides. This would be the numbers. We do show a total in the audited financial statements. You see a total district view. You see both gas, water, and total district. When we're setting rates and stuff, we look at them separately, but this is how we look. And it's kind of interesting when you look at the operating revenues, really how flat they are, and all, you know, 14-15 budget. We really do a pretty good job on both revenues and operating expenses as far as our budgeting process. Expenses related to GASB 67 and 68, and Pat Beckham will talk about a little more, for the district, were $14.9 million in 2015. That was not in our budget nor last year. This measure of how you expense it is totally different than we've ever seen in the prior years. In 2014, we had a pension expense of $10.2 million, which directly related to what we called our annual required contribution. So what you saw in your financial statements was exactly what we were funding. This year, they're totally different calculations. So our pension expense between 14 and 15 went up by $4.7 million. So that's probably about half of the expense increase you see from prior year to this year. It's always the district's intent to make sure the gas and water divisions are self-sustaining and the operational expenses, debt service, and capital costs are funded out of the respective rate-setting processes. Headcount for the district was significantly under budget at the end of 2015. Focusing here on full-time positions, at December 31st, 2014, we had 841 full-time positions. Budget was 895. And at the end of the year 2015, 852. We did really start to look at any additional headcount or personnel and whether we really needed to fill those positions. So you see that we were successful not, with some of the process improvement and other things, not filling all those positions. And I think last month in the State of the District, you heard Scott say that we're going to manage 2016 to 855. That is our goal, to manage real close to where we ended 2015. The final slide is probably, we heard a lot about this last month at the State of the District too, but these are 3 financial key measures that are very important to the district. We keep these in the forefront every time we're making decisions. So debt service coverage. First, we did have some activity on the bonds outstanding on the water side this year. You'll remember in December we completed a new bond issuance. 2 components to fund additional work around Florence for the next 3 years and to refund our 2006 A and B bonds. The result of that transaction saves the district just under $1 million of interest each year, or a reduction in total interest payments over the next 17 years of $16.4 million. You can see on the slide that we are required to have a debt service coverage ratio related to those outstanding bonds, and the requirement is 1.2 times. You can see both in 2014 and 15, we have very strong performance at the 2.26 and the 2.57. So we watch that closely, and we are doing a great job there. Cash reserves, the next section. Another measure of strength and the ability to manage through swings in business is our amount of cash reserves. This is a critical measure to rating agencies and to management to ensure one bad year does not actually cause a huge swing to our ratepayers and rates. Our internal goal is 180 days. You can see that we have focused on this point and had made progress this year. On both sides, we will continue to focus on the water operations, and our 5-year high-level strategic plan look we did with the budget showed us getting to 180 days over that 5-year
For
period.
both companies, 180 days?
We're obviously over already on gas. So,
But the goal is 180 days
yes,
for both
both
companies?
sides, independent. The final measure on this page is pension funding, and I won't steal all Pat's thunder because she's going to talk about it, but you can see that our funding amount remains stable at the 86% in 2015. One final comment on the district's commitment to our employees and retirees. I want to thank each and every board member for their actions at the February board meeting and on all the decisions you make. We set the district up with all the trust documents on the other post-employment benefits, which is our retiree medical. We will now fund this trust going forward and will continue to increase the funding as outlined in the 2016 budget. Also, the history of you supporting the retirement plan and making sure that we are doing the right amount of funding to that has always been very strong, so thank you. I also want to thank everybody in the district, because this just isn't my group doing these financial statements or Scott or the management team. Every position at the district makes a difference, and I assume that everybody is doing their job to ensure our financial records are accurate and helps make sure we are doing all that we can to have our rates reasonable for our customers. Each and every one of us should consider it our responsibility to always spend what is prudent and necessary. And we might have some discussion sometimes with individuals or me. So we do that. We do a great job delivering water and gas to each and every customer, and our employees have tremendous pride in what they do. Can't thank them enough as well as you. everybody, employees, and you make our job a lot easier. So everybody's supportive. Having said that, our focus needs to continue being on offering great service while looking at productivity and process improvement. We set up our process improvement team in 2015, and we have seen great strides there. We've had a number of process improvement streams. We've trained a lot of people on process improvement, Lean Six Sigma process, and people are now thinking like that. So that is a great thing for the district. That's all I had. Any questions on 2015?
I just can't remember the percentage that, we're talking about state requirements. If your pension funding drops below the funded ratio of, what was the amount you had?
80%.
Below 80, okay.
And when Pat does hers, you'll see, there's now, with this new literature, there's another way of calculating that funding too, so we'll look at it in the next presentation, so it's kind of confusing now, but. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I guess I'm going to introduce Pat here. So tab 6 now, you should see 3 bound books. You used to see 1, now you see 3. It's all more complex from Kavanaugh McDonald. Pat will discuss all this, so you know her very well, so welcome and thank you.
Thanks, Deb. Well, good morning.
Morning.
Yeah, everything seems to get more complicated instead of more simple, so. So this year you actually have the full bound report for funding. And then you have a presentation. And I thought this morning, because you probably would not like to spend the next hour going over the report, that we would just go through the presentation, which really just hits on the highlights, and then stop me at any time if you have any questions whatsoever. As Deb mentioned, so this year, I come and talk to you every year about the funding. What should the contribution be going in for the current year, and what's the funded status, and we're going to do that again. And to be honest, as an actuary, that's really where my focus and my heart is. But we do have these financial reporting requirements that both Kevin and Deb talked about, the new government accounting standards that we calculate the numbers for. Any hard questions, Kevin's still here and he'll answer those. But we do the calculations, and I'll go over those with you at the very end. So slide 2, just kind of a reminder that defined benefit pension plans are very long-term in nature as far as funding them. When we look at the projected benefit stream, and we have to do that for the new GASB standards, we have to project those out for just the current members, it'll go out 100 years. Okay, so it's just good to keep that very long-term perspective in mind when you think about funding and changes and assumptions. The benefit payments are really, the future benefit payments are the liabilities of the plan. And those are dependent on a number of unknown events. So we use actuarial assumptions to try to help us estimate, when they're going to start, what the amount will be, how long they'll be paid. It's prudent to keep an eye on the funded ratio, and it's also important to kind of do some projections looking forward that we include in the written report. So the main piece of information that comes out of this report, though, is a recommendation for what the contribution should be for the current year, 2016. On the next slide, on 3, the funding of the retirement plan is shared. The employees are contributing part of the cost, and then the district is contributing the balance. And you might remember a couple of years ago, there was a phase-in of contributions, and this year is the final step to 6% for the employees. It will continue at 6% beyond that. And then we have a funding policy in place that helps us determine what the recommended or the actuarial contribution is. So the difference between that actuarial rate and the 6% that comes from the employees is what falls to the district. On slide 4, the valuation is what we call a snapshot measurement. It's a single point in time. We took it today, it would look different all the way around. The liabilities look different and the assets would clearly look different. But it's that doing it January 1 of every year and then kind of laying those side by side that sometimes unfold a trend or something we want to kind of get in front of. I mentioned earlier that we use assumptions to help us anticipate the amount and timing of the benefit payments. We do an experience study, which is kind of an in-depth look at all of those assumptions about every 5 years. But those are our best estimate. So every one of those assumptions, there's kind of a reasonable range where that assumption could fall, whether it's retirement, investment return, salary increases. We're kind of shooting for the middle ground, okay? We're not trying to be overly conservative nor overly aggressive because we're allocating costs to periods of time. And so we want that to be kind of average and fair. But it's clearly would be another set of assumptions that we could use that would also be reasonable that would create different numbers. So it's just always important to recognize, even though in that report we show numbers to the dollar, they're not that exact. They're based on a lot of assumptions, and they're really subject to variation. So again, we're trying to look at the current funded status of the plan, develop a cost for the current year, and kind of look forward to see what we might expect. We'll just hit on kind of the membership, assets, liabilities, contribution rates. So on slide 5, you can see what the count by group is: active, disabled, inactive, vested, people who have a right to a benefit in the future. They're not yet eligible to draw it. And then, retirees and beneficiaries. The total count is exactly the same, which is strange, but the components obviously are different, but pretty stable all the way around. On slide 6, you might remember that we do not use pure market value in our calculations because it's extremely volatile. You know that. That volatility would translate directly to volatility in the contribution amount, which is generally problematic from a budgeting or standpoint. So we use something called an asset smoothing method to kind of recognize part of the gain or loss every year and give those ups and downs a chance to balance out. And that then creates more stability in the contribution rate and makes budgeting and anticipating costs in the future more stable.
And Pat, that's an accepted practice. That's just not specific for MED. That's throughout the industry.
That's a great question. Yes, that is very common. In fact, it's unusual to find a system that uses pure market. It's very much commonplace. On page 7, this clearly illustrates why we are using an asset smoothing method. So the blue line is market value returns for about the last 15 years. The red line is the return on the actuarial or smooth value. And the green line is the assumption, which is 7.25. So you can see the blue line clearly has more volatility. The red line still has some. I mean, again, we're mitigating the impact, but we can't totally erase it because we have to stay in touch with actual market value. But you can see during this period, the red line has been below the green line a number of years, and that does create what we call actuarial losses, where the actual experience is less favorable than what's assumed. That tends to push up your contribution amount. So on the next slide, on 8, see the actual numbers, how we went from really $333 million in market value in the January of 15 valuation to 329 in the January 16 valuation. And then on the right-hand column, you can see the smooth value. Again, what's going to show up in funded ratio, unfunded liability, and what's driving contributions is the right-hand column. So one important thing to note, in the January 115 valuation, you'll notice market value is higher than actuarial value by about 11 million. That means we had what we would call deferred or unrecognized gains. And right or wrong, everybody feels better with that. So we flipped January 1 of 16. Now the actuarial value is about 10 million higher than the market value, which means we have deferred or unrecognized losses. If we have gains in the future to help balance that out, it'll be fine. If we don't, those will flow through. Again, this is a timing mechanism for smoothing. You can see the return on market value is pretty much 0, and that translated through, we still had over a 6% return on actuarial value because we didn't recognize the strong investment performance the last couple of years. So that's exactly what smoothing is supposed to do, kind of mitigate that impact. Just so I don't forget, so that 6.23 is less than our assumed 7.25. That would have generated an actuarial loss on assets. We did have an actuarial gain on liabilities from there was no cost of living adjustment, which means liabilities were lower. And so there was a little bit of an offset there that helped. On slide 9, That first item, actuarial liability, the plan is being funded with the theory or the intent to put money in while people are working that will accumulate to enough when they retire to turn around and pay them out until payments stop. On that basis, in a perfect world where all the assumptions were always met, your assets would be equal to that number on line 1. Okay, so 394 million would be perfect, and then you would only have to worry about putting in costs in the future as people earn benefits, right? Continue to work. We're not quite there. Most plans are not. And so the value of the assets we just looked at was 339 million. That difference is what we call the unfunded actuarial liability, which is basically telling us we're behind schedule on our plan, on our funding plan by about 55 million. And that means additional contributions will have to come in the future to finance that difference in addition to what you're going to pay for employees who are actively working. Okay, so there'll be 2 pieces in our contribution that we'll look at in a minute. I think these numbers were in Deb's slides, line 4, the funded ratio. Again, the smooth value of assets divided by the actuarial liability, 86%. We don't really have comparative information for January 1, 16 valuations because you guys are always ahead of the pack. But if we even look back to last year, you know, you're mid-80s for funded ratio. If we look at the public funds survey that is about 125 plans, the average funded ratio there is kind of mid-70s. So, you know, you've done well. You've always been really good about putting the full actuarial contribution in, which is what it takes to make these plans successful. All right, slide 10. Again, now looking at contributions. So we've measured liabilities, we've calculated assets, now we need a plan to make up the difference. The normal cost is that amount I mentioned that as people are actively working, money's going in to fund their ultimate benefit. That's the normal cost. Okay? It's the ongoing cost of the plan given the benefit structure, the assumptions, and your current membership. It's not dependent at all on how much assets you have. Then we have a component for administrative expense, and then that UAL payment is the mechanism in place to make up that 55 million unfunded liability. That payment that we calculate is done as a level % of payroll, and what that really means is the dollar amount will actually, by design, increases every year. Payroll's expected to increase. So from a budgeting standpoint, your percentage is intended to be level even though the dollars increase. So slide 11 shows you what the components of the actuarial contribution are for 2016 versus 15. So again, the normal cost, the value of the benefits, about 17.4%. We add the cost of the administrative expenses for the year, it's 15 basis points. The UAL payments, 4.9, so the total actuarial contribution rate is 22.44. Again, employees are contributing 6 of that. So the difference, 16.44, falls to the district. If we take that times expected payroll, the actuarial contribution's 10.2. Then you can see the very last line is what we've kind of developed as a recommended contribution. And we've done this, I think, for the last 4 years, maybe 5, where if the actuarial amount is lower than last year's actual, we just recommend you continue to put the same amount in as you did last year. It's actually worked out really well. I was looking back in the history. And by doing that, you've avoided the, oh, it's really good, it's down. Oh, it's really bad, it's up. You've been able to kind of maintain it there for several years. So not a big difference this year, but recommending, if you can, to continue with the 10.3 million in 2016. On the next page, just kind of wrap up, again, the funding. Investment return pretty much drives the bus. Things like having gains from COLAs help, but it's really investment return is a heavy driver on both the funded ratio and the contribution amounts. So that flat return on market value, which we have not fully recognized because of smoothing, again, kind of flipped us from having a deferred gain in the 15 valuation to a deferred loss in the 16 valuation. How that plays out over time will depend on what the returns are, this year, next year, and years thereafter. That increase in the employee contribution rate actually lowered the district's contribution amount by just under $700,000. And again, the amount we're recommending for this year is the $10.3 million, which is the same amount as last year. So I want to pause there because we've been through all the funding numbers and see if you have any questions there before we go on to the financial reporting numbers. Any takers? Okay, great. So we have just a couple of slides to hit the highlights on the GASB 67 and 68, which are the new accounting standards that are reflected in your 2015 financials for the first time. If you don't remember anything else, please remember the bolded bullet, because as an actuary, I have to make sure you understand that. All of the work we do for the accounting numbers do not impact funding numbers at all, okay? Nothing's changed. We just now are doing two sets of calculations for two different purposes. And I know it's hard. I've been working with a lot of plans and boards. Sometimes it's hard to understand that, but they're really for two different purposes, and that's why the numbers will be different, and they're really intended to be. These numbers are following the accounting standards. They're very specific about how the calculations are to be made, and we don't really have, a lot of discretion there. Nor do you, as far as on the funding side, you have some discretion on funding policy, but here you do not. It does require some additional calculations and work on the actuary's part to provide this information to your auditors. We do a projection just looking at your current membership and contributions associated with those members in future years to make sure the fund doesn't run out of money. It's not a realistic projection. It's just one that we have to do to see if we can use the 7.25 long-term assumed rate of return to discount or to calculate our liabilities. Okay? The good news is we were able to use the 7.25. We also, remember, when you look at these numbers, these are market value. Okay? There's no smoothing. And then at the very end, you'll see they do have what's called a sensitivity analysis, where you just look at changing that discount rate 1% up or down to see what the impact is on your funded ratio and your net pension liability. So page 14, as if actuaries are not misunderstood already, now we have more terms. And none of them are the same as the ones you're used to, so we'll live with that challenge. So just a quick primer here, that the TPL is the total pension liability. It's, in your case, not in every case, but in your case, it's comparable to that actuarial liability we looked at on the funding side, okay? And then again, I mentioned that fiduciary net position is the market value of assets. And then the difference between those two is the net pension liability, okay? And that's the amount that shows up on your balance sheet. And then the last item there is pension expense. Again, it's not related to the 10.3 million at all. It's calculated totally different. It's just the cost from an accounting standpoint that gets allocated to the current year. Okay. So on slide 15, here's what the numbers look like, both at December 31, 14 and 15. And these are, again, new calculations. But you can see the first line's the TPL, the total pension liability, and then the market value of assets is the second line. The net pension liability, and I think Kevin alluded to this, was about 42 million at the beginning of the period and 66 million at the end of the period. The funded ratio on this basis went from 89%, 12/31/14, to 83%, 12/31/15. And then pension expense, we didn't have a number for the prior year because that standard was not in place. So 15 is the first year we actually calculated a pension expense, so it was just under 15 million for that year. And then the last slide that I have for the GASB 67 to 68 is that sensitivity analysis I mentioned earlier. And again, this is required as part of the standard. And you can see that if you change the discount rate, so it's right now it's 7.25, you go down to 6.25 or 8.25, it changes the total pension liability. Assets, of course, don't change. And so that entire difference in the first line ends up in the net pension liability. So it's good to remember you've got kind of a leveraging going on because those numbers are fairly close, and then the entire difference ends up in that bottom line, which is why it's very dramatic. So it goes from 66 million, down to 24 million at 8.25, or up to 117 million with 6.25. This is changing only the discount rate, no other assumptions. So our assumed rate of return actually has a component that is inflation that touches salary increases as well. So all I would say is, it's not necessarily true that, if we change the assumption to 6.25, these would be the numbers, because there may be other changes, the COLA or the salary, that might flow with a lower discount rate. This is strictly for sensitivity analysis purposes.
Say that last part again.
If there were actually, for funding purposes, a change in the discount rate that dramatic, we might see changes in the cost of living adjustment and the salary increase assumption from a funding standpoint.
Okay.
So we just caution people, this is just a sensitivity analysis which says, well, if we just change this by 1%, what happens to the number? The number doesn't have a lot of value.
What's the relationship between the assumed rate of return and what you use for the assumptions and the inflation and salary increases?
The assumed rate of return is what we call the building block approach. So there's a component that is essentially price inflation, and then a real rate of return.
Yes.
Okay. And right now, that inflation is 3.1%.
Okay.
Okay. So if you were to drop a whole percent, the question is, how much is that to do to lower expectations for inflation versus lower real return?
I get it. That's what I was looking at. Thank you.
Good question. Thank you. And then you can see the funded ratio, goes anywhere from 74 to 93 with that kind of a change. A 2% range in discount rate is pretty wide. And you can see the impact there. That concludes my formal comments. If anybody else has questions, I would be more than happy to address those.
Let me ask you this. Aside from the statistical data, all these numbers, I'm not sure how much of us we really understand, to be honest. Where are we from a practical standpoint on our pension, where we're at now and where we're going?
Okay, well, and I was kind of trying to put that in context, giving you that funded ratio of other public plans that are kind of, at least a year ago, were in the mid-70s, and you're in the mid-80s. Okay, so I think you're ahead of the pack there. You're obviously above the 80% threshold the legislature is determined is important. You also have a plan in place to eliminate the unfunded liability. For a number of years, that was kind of on what we call an open amortization, which is...
We've closed it.
Yeah, and so in 14, we closed it. So seems like a long way out, but at least 28 years from now, that's gone. And the new pieces we're amortizing over a shorter period. So we'll get to a place where everything will be over 20 or fewer years. And like I said, you've been very, very good about contributing the actuarial rate even when it was difficult, which is quite frankly why I think you're
So if we
86% funded. So
Yeah,
I think
if
you're on the right course.
I'll say if we're on the right course, if we're reducing this unfunded liability by the plan we're using now, that's where we're going.
Yeah, in a perfect world, for actuaries anyway, you want to be 100% funded. If you're not 100% funded, you want to be on the path to 100% funded.
So there's no real significant reason to change our path right now, our plan right now.
I don't think so. I think, you stay the course, and the ride gets bumpy at times because of, you saw the return on market value. That's the big one that everybody struggles with.
Pat, had we not negotiated the employee contribution from 4.8 to 6%, what kind of picture would we be looking at right now?
Well, the contribution instead of 10.3 would have been 11 million this year.
700,000.
700,000 this year, and, you know, that percentage, if payroll increases, the dollars would go up.
And it actually went from 3.76% to 6% phased in over the period of a couple of years.
Right.
Right. Mhm.
Right, yeah, so that was important.
Pat, a question you probably get a lot is with regard to the assumed rate of return. How do you respond when you get asked, well, there's no way that we'll reach 7.25%? And I see that in between 08 and 09, the assumed rate went from 7% to 7.25%. How do you respond to that pointed question?
You're right, and that, it comes up a lot, and there's been a lot of activity in this area in about the last 10 years, and 5 in particular. Part of it is the perspective, and remember the very first thing I said to you, is this is a long-term commitment to fund a pension plan. And our actuarial standards of practice, which are professional guidance that we follow, actually tell us we can't give too much weight to recent experience. So when, you know, because everybody says, well, you're never going to earn 7%, some are at 8, you're never going to earn 8. You know, that's kind of a strong statement when the life of the plan is, in a way, perpetuity. I mean, it doesn't end unless action's taken to end it. So it has an advantage each of us here does not have as an individual investor. I have to be cognizant of when I'm going to retire and start drawing my money out, but the plan doesn't. So that long-term perspective is important. Again, part of the issue that has driven down rates of return in the last 5 to 10 years is a big change in expectation for inflation. And your expectations come down as well, but I'm old enough to remember when people were using 4.5 for an inflation assumption, and now most are around 3. So even if the real rate of return doesn't change, if the inflation's come down that much, then, you know, the rates have come down. We continue to monitor it. That's why we do experience studies on a regular basis, at least every 5 years, is to keep an eye on this. Other things that drive that are asset allocation. And a lot of times pension funds will have access to investments that we as individuals do not, or they get a better expense ratio on those than we do. And in general, they're getting professional investment advice that should be worth something that creates a higher return alpha. So kind of all those things together, but I almost, the long-term perspective is a big, big part of it that we just have to really drive home when we talk about
I'm
it.
sure you and other actuarial experts get an earful on that topic.
You could say that. A lot of it's education. But, and you know, I mean, human nature, like I said, I've been doing this a long time. So I remember back in the 90s, whenever, you know, everybody thought, again, if we were using 7.5 or 7 back then, people thought you were crazy because everybody was going to earn at least 10. We didn't go up to 10 back then, and likewise, we're not going to swing and go way conservative at this point. I mean, actuaries are very kind of middle of the road kind of people. We're not knee-jerk reaction, and so we stay the course. And then if we believe it's really a trend that's here to stay, like lower inflation, then we'll make a change eventually and see how that flows through. But for you in particular, because of the COLA, it's almost, in some ways, it's not just a one-sided change. You know, your rate of return would be lower, but your COLA would also be lower.
Yeah.
If you go below 3.
Which is, we didn't have a COLA adjustment this past time,
Right.
so.
Right.
But if you're wrong, you just change the assumption.
You know, the good part is if you're an actuary, no one would be able to prove you're wrong until after you're at least not working if not dead. So 30 years from now, you guys can critique me and see how we did. That's right.
Thanks for addressing that, Pat. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Very
Thank
good.
you. Thank you.
Very
Pat.
good presentation.
I just have a couple quick things. I don't have to address a couple of them because one of them I was going to address is the 725. Pat gets asked that a lot, and she gets pushed. She's our actuary. We do have investment advisors that we hire, which are Vanguard. Prior to that, it was DeMarsh. And we do look at the investment policy statement. We do talk about that rate of return And they would, Vanguard, I believe, told us over the 5 to 10 year horizon, makes them a little nervous, but again, we're long-term and they have been comfortable with that also, so.
And we did lower our cost when we made the switch.
And we lowered our costs fairly significantly going to Vanguard. I was gonna talk about the employees paying more and thank them, so we already talked about that. The final thing, Gwen will be making a motion to approve the 10.3 million. In the budget, we had 9.8 million for our annual estimated required contribution. So Pat's recommending and management concurs with the recommendation that we should still plan to fund that 10.3 million, which is $500,000 more. We will manage that without any impact to our ratepayers or anything. We will manage such that we can fund at the 10.3 level instead. So Gwen will be making a motion to approve that today since we had 9.8 million.
Was it 10.3 last year? Budgeted for?
It was
last year?
10.3 last year, and we should have had the 10.3 in there.
Well, I mean, just to comment, the reason we lowered is we reflected the impact of employees contributing more, and were it not for the performance of the stock market, the contribution would have been closer to 9.9.
And
You just can't predict the stock market.
And that's fair, but we didn't really go through the discussion of should we stay higher
Yeah.
anyway, so.
Would a baseline be what the previous year's budgeted was going forward?
That's what we're saying, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even if it
But
goes a little lower, we'd like to still
The
fund
math
it.
that has changed, though, is
Sure.
the employee contribution.
Yes.
Sure, but the only thing, we will make sure we understand with the legislature, we're still using the actuarial funding, not this new GASB. So we'll make sure that we know which one they're looking at when they're making their decisions too. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we're headed for tab 7.
Yep, Ron's got it.
Good morning. The capital expenditures letter can be found behind tab 7. There are 13 items on the letter this morning, and I'd like to briefly discuss 2 of those items. Both of those items are behind, are under the building plants and equipment section. And both of these projects are related to the Florence Capital Improvement Plan. Item number 2 is a $900,000 request for the analysis and design for architectural, structural, and building system improvements to the Florence Minnelusa High Service Pump Station, which was originally placed into service around 1890. Specific building systems to be studied will include mechanical systems such as plumbing, heating, air conditioning, instrumentation and controls, and electrical equipment and switchgear. Other requirements of this project will include design for the installation of the new high service number 3 pump, motor, and controls, improved roof access and overhead crane capability, building security, and monitors. The consultant will also provide assistance throughout the bidding process and limited service during the construction. Submittals from engineering firms as part of a request for proposal process are currently being reviewed, and management is recommending that with your approval of this expenditure this morning, that the president will be allowed to enter into a professional services agreement with the selected engineering consultant. The second item that I would like to briefly discuss is number 3, again under buildings, plants, and equipment. This is a $155,000 request for an engineering consultant to study the chemical treatment processes and chemicals currently being used at the Florence treatment plant, and to recommend any changes to those processes and chemicals. The information that is generated in this portion of the study will provide the basis for a conceptual design of future chemical equipment and application points, and will most likely have a considerable effect on the future use and possible layout of the existing chemical building. It is conceivable that the administrative offices and laboratory that are currently in the chemical building may have to move to a new facility in order to provide adequate space for any treatment or equipment changes. This study will help refine the Florence Capital Improvement Plan and also include analysis of energy usage throughout the plant and identify potential energy efficiencies and savings. Going forward, we will be looking closely at the timing of the Florence projects, which will be competing with other capital-intensive projects such as water main replacement. Management is recommending that with your approval of this expenditure, that the president be authorized to enter into a professional services agreement with Black & Veatch as our engineering consultant. Are there any questions on these 2 items or any other item on the capital Just expenditure? offhand, Ron, 155,000. This looks like a whole lot of money to do a study. Do we get any other bids in on that?
Basically, we had a request for proposals. We talked to, was it Joel, three consultants. It's going to be a fairly inclusive, detailed study and preliminary design for the treatment processes and what kind of equipment, what kind of chemicals we may be using down the road. So it's a pretty extensive and detailed study and conceptual design.
But no one else bid on it?
Again, there were three consultants that we looked at and interviewed, and the decision was Black and Veatch.
Was this the cheapest?
Joel, was this cheapest as far as selecting Black and Veatch?
No, it was not.
And why not?
Did you get the question?
The price, you mean?
Right.
Yeah. There was 3 consultants. One was somewhat lower. We really felt it was rather incomplete in a lot of ways, just not a very good proposal at all. So, and the other 2 were just very close. So it was really a very close decision between Black and Veatch and the next. The other one was very slightly lower. They were essentially the same. And we thought Black and Veatch brings a kind of an outside perspective, kind of another look at our processes, our treatment. They're a worldwide company located in Kansas City, and I think they'll really help us, take a fresh look at all our processes and treatment out there and how that chemical building needs to look, because that's a big project that's coming up in the next few years. And the layout and like Ron said, the lab and the office space in there, does that stay? Do we need to move those out? Those are big decisions, and this will help us firm up what we need in the form of chemicals. Do we need dry carbon, or how we do our lime slaking and some things like that that really affect the footprint. So that's where we're headed.
That's fine, thank you.
Ron, I have a question on number 4, the 6 replacement sedans. Are these specialized type vehicles?
No, they're going to be Chevy Impalas. That'll be the recommendation on that John will be presenting.
Why aren't we getting the CNG vehicle instead?
There's
Well,
not any.
Right now, the manufacturers are no longer, that we found, are manufacturing a gaseous prepped engine.
Honda quit.
Honda was the last of the breed.
Okay, so it would have to be converted, which would cost.
Even that, we converted some F-150 pickups that were not gaseous prep engines. We've already had one engine fail.
We're having issues with valves.
So they really need to be a gaseous prep engine, so it's not a matter of converting them, it'd be a matter of tearing the whole engine apart and putting it back together with hardened valves and so on set up for it, so it's.
Is it because of the cost of gasoline right now?
I think that's part of it. That and the fact that even before, when gasoline was higher, the Honda, very good, reliable vehicle, CNG, but it was hard to get a payback on it because they don't use very much fuel. So even though you had that spread, you got a vehicle that's getting 40 miles to a gallon, you're not using enough fuel.
160,000 miles on it till you break even.
Yeah, we were,
Even get close.
we couldn't show a payback on them, even with the Honda Civics. They're a great operating vehicle and very cheap, but we just don't put enough. You have to really drive them to get
Are
the
we seeing
payback.
this in the big, heavy equipment
Nope,
too?
heavy equipment is staying there,
Okay.
but there's where that spread and your fuel usage is
Consumption.
great enough, yes,
Mileage.
that it makes sense money-wise. So buses and our trucks and garbage
They're
trucks
still
and all
in.
of that stuff. Actually, there's still a lot of work going on making the engines better, but on those real light vehicles, that seems to be dropping off rapidly now.
Okay, thank you.
Quick question, I don't know if there will be any crossover, and I only asked because it's Florence, and I know Florence is a big plant, but the evaluation of the building systems and design on number 2, on page 3, and then number 3, both have a little crossover looking at power consumption. They both have that mentioned. Is there going to be any crossover there with those two, whoever the professionals are that we use Black and Veatch on our number 3 and whoever number 2 will be, where they will compare notes? Is it power consumption geographically far enough away that it's not gonna make any difference, like the chemical building versus the pump number 3.
Basically, and Joel, correct me if I'm wrong, on the Minnelusa station, it's basically going to be looking at all of our existing gear, electrical components, switch gear. It isn't going to be so much energy consumption, but looking at the equipment that's there, tying in the proposed number 3 pump. That particular study or design won't be necessarily looking at the overall energy consumption of the different facilities.
So number 3 is gonna look at the entire plant, the entire Florence plant, where number 2 is, sorry?
Yeah, the pumps.
Mainly the large pumps, the big high service pumps and the low service pumps, so that's gonna be their focus.
So they will have to know what the first consultant is planning to put in, right?
Yes, yes.
That's,
And it'll be similar to number 1, which we replaced a couple years ago. It's a variable frequency drive, which is efficient, but they're gonna look at all the other pumps.
I guess that's kind of what I'm asking. I'm assuming that you've got a project manager that's gonna make sure that the coordination.
there will have to be coordination between the two.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tab 8.
Tab 8 is the acceptance of contract and payment of final estimate. There's a single water main project listed for your approval this morning. Are there any questions on that single item? Thank you.
Tab 9, Joe.
Joe?
Good morning. I'm here to present behind tab 9, change order number 1 for the guard service contract. It's a relatively straightforward issue. We have a critical position in the security posture in the guard position at our security center. And we've been unable to attract and keep people in that position. 2015, we experienced over 200% turnover in that position. And our proposal is to increase the wage by $2 an hour. Minimum wage has gone up $2 an hour since the inception of this contract, and the job market in Omaha has improved with more jobs available with higher pay. So this will bring us closer in comparison to some of the other companies in Omaha, what they pay in this position, but we'll still be on the low end even at this. Any questions about the position or the change order?
Are we taking into account any possibility of using armed security instead of contracting with a security firm? These folks are not armed, correct?
That is correct. At this point, for contract guard service, we're not considering armed positions.
We're certain that the reason for the turnover is due to the pay. Are there other factors that contribute to that?
I cannot guarantee that, but
It usually
in
is.
studies done by our Allied Barton, our security service provider, in other areas in the Midwest, when they've increased the pay, it has helped reduce the turnover. Sure. But I can't guarantee that. Yeah. Any other questions?
Nope.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Here we go.
Bids.
Good morning.
Hi.
Morning, John.
Bids on materials and contracts may be found under tab 10. On page 1, there are 2 water main projects, which we are recommending the rejection of the bids. On both projects, we only received 1 bid. The bid for the Highlander redevelopment project was 41% higher than the engineer's estimate, and the bid for the cast iron replacement project in Parkview Boulevard was 88% higher than the engineer's estimate. Both of these projects have an element of difficulty that may have persuaded contractors from bidding the projects. In addition, we believe the market is saturated and there is an abundance of easier, more profitable work, allowing contractors to be more selective on the projects they bid. This is definitely a challenge for us, as there is a lack of contractors for the amount of available work in the Omaha area. We will be looking at ways to better leverage our ability to attract contractors. A couple of strategies we will explore are designing and bidding projects earlier, allowing for contractors to plan work further out into their schedules. And as in the case of water infrastructure replacement projects, package multiple projects into a single contract that would guarantee work during the construction season. In order to achieve our replacement goals, this will obviously be an effort that will need to be done by both the district and the contracting community. So we will be working closely with them to try and move forward on this.
Just so you get an idea, I mean, it is possible that you will be approving a project like today that we're not planning to actually build until a year later. That's how far I think we're gonna have to get ahead so that we're in here and.
Yeah, and actually
get
the
prices.
cast iron replacement project in Parkview Boulevard is going to be relooked at, rephased. The scope may change a little bit. That will be bid later this year for work to begin in 2017.
What do we do with the redevelopment, though, while the development itself is going on? Are we going to hold up the redevelopment?
Actually, on that particular one, the developer has chosen to go through our WCD policy, water contractor development policy, where they will hire the contractor themselves.
He's gonna see if he can negotiate a better price.
Okay, thank you.
All right, the next item I'd like to discuss is the vendor invoice management project on page 2. This project will allow the district to process vendor invoices quickly, accurately, and efficiently while enhancing productivity, cash flow, and vendor relations. The application will allow invoices that meet set criteria to be automatically paid, allowing staff to just focus on the exceptions. Approval of Optima ECM's proposal is recommended for approval. We accepted bids on 6 4-door flex fuel sedans, which can also be found on page 2. We already had some discussion as to why those weren't CNG. Bids were accepted for the Ford Taurus, Chevy Impala, and Dodge Charger flex fuel vehicles. We are recommending approval of Husker Auto Group's bid, in which they will be providing the Impalas.
John, can I ask a question about that?
Yes.
This is, can't recall for sure, but why is the CNA 130 when the bid's 104?
The CNA takes into account overheads and other, putting the decals and getting the cars ready for our fleet.
So at that amount, we're saying that 6 cars are going to be about, what, $4,000 each to do that?
That's with our overheads.
Yeah, overhead's about a little north of 9% by the time you put all the admin overheads on, when you capitalize the vehicle, in addition to the prep that John described.
Transportation.
Give your garage overhead, your general, you got a ton of, it adds up.
But if we're approving a CNA of 130, then is this on the books, the other $25,906?
Yes, when you capitalize it in the books, it's the higher amount.
Okay. All right.
Any other questions on that one?
Nope, thank you.
The last item I'd like to discuss is the extension of the concrete and asphalt pavement repairs at the various MED construction sites, which can be found on page 3. Just real quick, I'd like to note that the paving repairs covered under this contract typically do not include repairs that are made within the jurisdictional boundaries of Omaha and Bellevue, as they typically make their own repairs, even for our work. The scope of this contract is for paving repairs in other communities within the district boundaries, such as Springfield, Utan, Bennington, and Fort Calhoun. The original contract was for 2 years between the period of June 1st, 2014 and May 31st of 2016. At the time the contract was bid, there was only 2 bids, in which one of the bids was rejected because the contractor didn't meet the qualifications required to fulfill the contract. Swain Construction has agreed to hold their current pricing for an additional year, and we are recommending approval of the extension. And that's all I have, and I'll have to answer any further questions.
So on this Swain Construction, I don't think I've ever asked this before, and I don't mean to prolong this, but, so they're bidding $205,000. Do they get that regardless of how many, or is it?
No.
Is it how does that work?
It's based on an estimate, so the contract itself is set up for unit quantities.
Okay.
Both, well, we typically do the removal, but basically prepping the paving cut for the repairs, any sort of surface work. I think we bring it up to a certain elevation. They finish that elevation off. It's the travel time, back and forth. So no, they're not guaranteed that 200 plus. They get paid for the work that they do based on their unit pricing.
Got it. Thanks.
Thank you.
John, can you just address the new requirement for contractors that is based on the recently passed law in the legislature? Ron, you might be able to address this more so than John.
I'm not sure John was too involved with this, but legislature passed a requirement that any construction contracts with a political subdivision, there has to be a clause in the contract that the contractor is assuring all of their employees, their subs employees are all legally entitled to be working in the United States. So we are going to be adding provisions to our foreign contracts that require them to do that, and any general is responsible for the subs. So the general is taking the responsibility on behalf of any subs that they use to make sure that people are qualified to be working in the United States.
What happens upon a violation?
They can be potentially fined, I believe, by the Attorney General's office, and we don't have to use that contractor in the future if they're found to have violated. That would be the district's option. The district doesn't have any direct statutory authority to penalize them, but it could result in their having trouble at the state level and being able to continue business at the state. But we would have the option, if we found someone in violation, to, just like we have other qualifications for bidders that we reject, if we don't think they're capable of doing the work, we wouldn't have to use that contractor in the future.
Good.
And we've already implemented that provision into our standard contract language.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Ross.
Good job, Jim.
Whoa.
The main extensions letter can be found behind tab 12. There's a single water main project listed for your approval this morning. This is a supplemental request of $27,713 for a project that was previously approved at the January board meeting in the amount of $115,676. The initial request was based on a preliminary engineering estimate, and the developer is aware of the additional costs that are now based on the final design and contractor's bid. Any questions on main extensions? Thank you.
Tab 13, personnel. Mr. Tripp.
Good morning, board members. Let's take a look at tab 13. As of April 1st, we had 857 employees with the district. There were 7 pending retirements and resignations, so that helps us towards Scott's goal of trying to keep the employee count at a lower number. This month, we have 9 OAC promotions and progressions in the report. I'd ask that you approve those. And we have no requests for new hires, promotions, or ratifications for salaried employees.
Good.
Any questions?
Good. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you.
Okay.
I believe on tab 14 should be the legislative report. I'm going to skip around to bills that have had some recent activities. Starting on page 2, LB 711 by Senator Hughes was the bill to recreate the riparian vegetation management task force. Again, that bill, the purpose of that bill was to help improve stream flow by getting rid of invasive plants such as Phragmites. That bill started with an initial request of $2 million. It's been lowered down to $1 million. And it was amended onto LB 1038, which we're going to discuss a little bit later. As amended onto 1038, that bill is currently on final reading. Moving on to LB 725 by Senator Shoemaker. That bill was again supported by the district, which would exempt the recording of utility deeds from the requirement of having to file the real estate transfer statement 521. That bill is passed and is currently subject to Governor Ricketts' consideration. LB 783 was the bill from Senator Lindstrom that permitted large public power districts to register their vehicles in the county of their headquarters. The district took an interest in this bill because of the second aspect, and that was to allow us to maintain permanent license plates. At the committee hearing with board approval, we requested that we be amended onto that bill. The sponsors of the legislation were worried that if MUD was amended onto that bill, it would make it more difficult for that bill to be considered for the consent calendar. We were taken off of that bill. I've had discussions with Senator Lindstrom, and he has indicated that he's got an interest in working with the district next session to make sure that any likely change in new law would be applicable to the district. So assuming the board still approves, my plan is to work with Senator Lindstrom over the interim and hope to accomplish the goal as it relates to allowing the district to maintain permanent license plates.
The problem is next year's a new plate year anyway, so we'll have to get plates for the cars, and it'll be another
Yep.
6 years after that before we realize.
We
the
lose any
benefits, so-
advantage.
I'm gonna ask Gwen, is that a legitimate reason for not, the reason they gave?
Because so that it would be placed on the consent calendar. Consent calendar is very restrictive, and it probably was.
Okay. Thanks.
I mean, if there's any objection, it's kicked off at consent, so.
Okay.
And anybody would want their bill on consent.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, keep at it and let us know 6 years from now how that's going.
It does lose the
Hopefully it'll
value.
still-
Loses almost all value right away.
Sometimes progress is slow, but hopefully we'll be able to get that one done in the next 6 years.
Okay, thank you.
Another update, LB 1044, that was Senator Epke's bill to terminate the Commission of Industrial Relations. Just wanted to give the board a heads up that the Business and Labor Committee has an LR 512 that would look to examine the CIR over the interim. In other words, the committee's going to be doing a study in all likelihood of the CIR. Lastly, LB 1038 was the bill that allowed for the transfer of property rights and water rights from Nebraska Public Power District to a coalition of natural resource districts and game and parks. That bill became the committee's Christmas tree bill, and there are a few other items attached onto it. It is currently on final reading, and my expectations are in all likelihood it'll be on the agenda tomorrow. And again, LB 1038, I think that one's probably going to go, but we'll know more after tomorrow. The last thing I have, there'll be some legislative studies that will be monitored over the interim, and in all likelihood, the next board report will list studies that are pertinent to the district.
5 days left.
We're almost there.
4.
Thank you.
Rick, let me ask you one question.
Thank you.
Is there any change from the last legislative report to this board as far as MED is concerned?
No.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rick.
Thank you.
Mr. Booker.
With no changes, Tom, your preference, you can just put it on file. There's no need for a motion.
That's why I asked that.
Yep. Final item we have on the agenda is a potential settlement with a manufactured gas plant cleanup at 20th and Center. Briefly, that plant was in existence prior to the existence of the district in 1918, so we inherited that plant when the city did the condemnation of the private gas company. We found some connections to the entity that we're proposing this settlement with, and the cleanup is in progress right now. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to drive by 20th and Center. You'll see a tremendous amount of activity going on right now. Based upon the level of the connections we were able to determine in the negotiations, we feel the proposed settlement that you have in front of you is a fair resolution of this matter concerning that other entity. I have reserved on the board agenda a closed session if you want to talk in more detail about the legal issues related to this. I'm happy to do that. I did provide you a second memo under attorney-client privilege that outlined kind of the legal issues that we were facing. But it's up to you if we don't need to have the closed session. When you get to that point on the board agenda, Chairman Frost, you can just indicate the closed session is not necessary. However, if you do want to go into closed session, that's what that placeholder is for. Any questions I can answer in the open session? Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, John.
Okay, the committee meetings are now adjourned. We'll reconvene in 10 minutes at,
How about quarter to?
9:45,
You don't think there's any funny business with the way they're seeing it? What makes, the only.
Somewhere in there.
Is what we're gonna pay for vehicles.